Good afternoon, everyone. I don't have an afternoon nap. Good afternoon. Thank you. Okay, welcome to this is our last lecture in our distinguished MIC lecture series for spring 2016. Today with us is our distinguished speaker, Professor Kim Potowski, from the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is now a professor of Spanish in the Department of Hispanic and Italian Studies. I asked for a 2-page CV from Professor Potowski, and I'm looking at it and I said, oh, wow, ever since 2014, she has had one book every year published. Think about this. 2014, Heritage Language Teaching Research and Practice, one book. 15, let's see how good my Spanish is, El Español de los Estados Unidos.
Very good, Agnes. Nice.
16, Inter-Latino Language and Identity, MexiRicans. I think this is what she's going to talk about today. And 2017, another book lined up, Handbook of Spanish as a Heritage Minority Language. Right? So from these titles, you would know that she is a strong voice in applied linguistics, in heritage linguistics, and heritage language education in general, and in Spanish in particular. In addition to writing books, she's also the executive editor of Spanish in Context of the journal, and for 3 years she was the co-editor of Heritage Language Journal. Her own research has covered a very wide scope, from formal structural features of phonetic accommodation, subjunctive development in Spanish, and discourse markers, to more of a sociocultural discursive issues of, for example, identities and ideologies, hybridized traditions, and Spanish language shift in the U.S. and in Chicago in particular. So you should also, I would advise you to check out her TEDx talk, which I watched. Just type in her name, TEDx, is called No Child Left, guess what? Monolingual. Right? So it is our honor and indeed our privilege to have Professor Potowski with us today. Please give her a big round.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Agnes, for that lovely introduction. And thank you for having me here. I'm wearing my cyborg jetpack thing here. I hope it doesn't tickle me or distract anybody too much. I would very much like to thank Dr. Agnes Huff for inviting me here, along with Dr. Paco Ordóñez. I hear that you had something to do with bringing me out here. The Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication, of course, and the Department of Hispanic Languages and Literature, which hosted a lovely lunch today. And I want to thank all of you for coming here. So I am at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I've been there since '99, but guess what? I am from Long Island. Ooh, yep, I am from Comac. Ever heard of it? Yes. Exit 52, baby. All day long. So we're neighbors. But this semester, I'm actually on a fellowship at the CUNY Graduate Center. So I just hopped on the LIRR out to Ronkonkoma, and here I am. But I didn't come here to tell you about Comac. I came here to talk about Spanish in the U.S., and in particular, different kinds of Spanish in Chicago. I'm going to try to talk till about 3:15, and then leave 15 minutes for questions and answers. So I think that's what I should be doing. Some people are surprised when I tell them that I study Spanish in the United States, because they think if you study Spanish, you must study either Spanish from Spain or Spanish from Latin America. And then I say to them, well, do you know what the largest by population Spanish-speaking countries are in the world? Okay, does anybody here know what the number one most populous, largest in population, not geography, Spanish-speaking nation in the world is? Any guesses? What do you guess? No guesses at all. Spain might be on that top list. What else? Very, very populous. Yes? Mexico. Okay, here, can you see that pretty well? Okay, so Mexico, 112 million people, so it is the largest by population Spanish-speaking nation on the planet. Okay? Then you have Colombia, Spain, Argentina, United States. If you look at us, we have about 311 million when this data comes from. Okay, about 52 million Hispanic or Latino, and I use those terms interchangeably. I realize there's a polemic about which term to use, and I hope you'll just allow me to kind of go back and forth. But do all U.S. Latinos speak Spanish? No, they do not. Those who report speaking Spanish in the home is 34.8 million, so that puts us in 5th place. These data say that we have more Spanish speakers in the United States than they do in Peru, Venezuela, Chile, Ecuador, Bolivia, or any place else that's not these places, right? Okay. However, this 34.8 million does not include the approximately 11 million undocumented folks who are living here in the U.S. So get out your calculators. A lot of you all are in STEM, right? 34.8 plus 11 is awesome. 45.8 million speakers. Okay, so that bumps us up. Nor does this figure include approximately 3 million people who are not Latino or Hispanic, but who speak Spanish in their homes. So weirdos like me. In my family, right, I speak Spanish to my children. So when you add 45.8 plus 2.8, what do you get? What, have you seen this already? Did you just do it that quickly? That was really impressive. 48.6 million, and where does 48.6, we're gonna let somebody else answer, the little math guy over here. 48.6 puts us where then? Second. We are the second largest Spanish-speaking nation in the galaxy. Okay? I think this is important to remember. What else do we know about the U.S. Latino population? We know that it's the most diverse. Okay? If you go to Mexico, what you're going to hear is typically Mexican varieties of Spanish. If you go to Peru, you're going to hear Peruvian varieties of Spanish. When you come to the U.S., you're going to hear everything. Okay? Our largest national origin group is Mexican, so 63% of U.S. Latinos are of Mexican origin. Of course, here in New York, you see more Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, etc., but they're all here in the United States. So what this means is that you get a lot of dialect variation. In one country, they'll call this an avocado a palta, right? But in Venezuela, they'll call it an aguacate. Okay? So what people are starting to ask themselves is what happens when all these different groups come and live together? What does Spanish in the US look like when we know that all these different groups say a lot of things differently? Not just the words they use, but the way they pronounce words as well. And I'll come back to that in a minute. To look at the diversity in the United States from another angle, here I've put the top 10 Latino metro areas in the country. Of course, New York is second. And what do you notice about New York that you don't notice about anywhere else? New York has something really, really unique. Yeah?
They're all triple digits? Double digits.
They're all double, that's right. So you've got Puerto Ricans at 27, Dominicans at 20, Mexicans at 12. So this is pretty evenly distributed, isn't it? What about everybody else? What do you see with everybody else? Almost everybody else. Yeah?
There's one major group and then there's a little bit of a small groups.
Right. And what does that one major group tend to be? Mexican, right? So LA is of the Latinos in LA. I'm not saying LA is 78% Latino. I'm saying of the Latinos in LA, 78% of them are Mexican, right? Houston is also 78. Riverside, 87. You've got places as high as 91. San Antonio's Latino population is 91% Mexican, okay? The only other place that's sort of kind of diverse like New York is what? Miami. Miami, you've got 53% Cuban, and then you've got your Colombians and Nicaraguans. What do you notice about Chicago? 79, so that's kind of high, but look at that. Our next biggest group is in the double digits, isn't it? Okay, so that makes Chicago a very interesting place to study these issues of dialect contact. Sure, you're going to have issues of dialect contact in these other places. In fact, I know some people studying the contact between Mexican and Salvadoran in LA. Okay, but when you've got at least 10%, you've kind of got a critical mass where you can start to look at these things. Okay, dialect contact has indeed increasingly occupied the attention of linguists who are looking at U.S. Spanish. I won't go into this, but if you're interested, you can look this up later. Ana Celia Centella looked at lexicon here in New York City. Phonology is really popular. Everybody loves to look at how different things are pronounced. Morphosyntax, pronouns are so hot right now. Everybody's looking at pronouns all day long. No one has done any pragmatics yet. The contact between, like, let's say a Puerto Rican pragmatic system and a Mexican pragmatic system, so that needs to be done. Paco, if you have any students who want to do a PhD dissertation, send them to me, please, in Chicago, and we will work on that. So what I hope to cover in the next 40 minutes, I'm going to be talking about Chicago. I'm going to tell you a little bit about interactions between Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, the two largest Latino groups in Chicago. I'm going to tell you about some of their Spanish features. What does their lexicon, that's like their vocabulary, what does that look like? And what does their phonology look like? That's their sound systems, okay? Then I'm going to talk to you about MexiRicans. Who are they? What are their Spanish features? And what are some of their identity performances look like, okay? I'm going to be using a corpus that I gathered with fellow Long Islander Lourdes Torres. She's from Brentwood, okay? But she's now at DePaul University in Chicago. So I guess I'm following her in life, right? We were both here, now we're both in Chicago. So chispa, in Spanish, what does chispa mean?
Spark.
Like a spark, right? Chicago, C-H-I, spa, Spanish, chispa, get it? Right? Cool name. Chicago Spanish. That's our corpus, okay? What we did was we gathered hour-long interviews. We call these Lebovian interviews. That just means that you try to get the person to be really relaxed and just talk about, you know, you don't want them to sit there, oh my God, this is a linguist, they're interested in how I speak, I better speak correctly. No, no, no. What you want to do is say, tell me about a recurring dream that you have. Tell me about games you played with when you were a kid. Did you fight a lot with your sister when you were young? Did you ever actually think you were going to die? Stuff like that, where they forget that they're being interviewed and they start, whoa, yeah, there was this one time, and they, right? That's what you're trying to do, okay? We have Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and MexiRicans, okay? We have G1, that's first generation. These are folks who immigrated to the United States after the age of 12, which means linguistically they have a full Spanish system, you could say. They're linguistically mature, okay? Second generation are the ones who are born to these parents here in the US, or their parents brought them here when they were about 5 years old. Is anybody here a G2? You were born here to immigrant parents, or your parents brought you here before you were 5? I got a lot of G2s here in the audience. Okay. Any G1s here in the audience? You came here after 12? Yeah? Okay. Paco, you're a G1. Raise your hand. Yeah. Okay. Guess what a G3 is? Third generation, which means they're the children of these guys, right? Anybody here born and raised in the U.S., both of your parents were born and raised in the U.S., and your grandparents were the ones who immigrated. Got any G3s here? Wow, I got everybody here. This is great. Okay, so does this make sense? This is the kind of people that we interviewed. This is the number of people in each category that we interviewed. There's no such thing as a first generation MexiRican. If you think about it, that doesn't make sense, right? So we just have second and third generation MexiRicans. This is what we did. Chicago, Illinois. Has anybody been to Chicago? All right, nice. Well, I hope you come back now that once you've learned all this great stuff. Until 2010, we had the second largest Mexican population in the country outside of LA. And we had the second largest Puerto Rican population on the mainland outside of New York City. Okay? But we recently have been dethroned from second place, and we have been bumped down into fourth place for both of these. Orlando and Philly have beat us with the Puerto Ricans. Riverside and Houston have beat us with the Mexicans, okay? Yet and still, we do have, as you saw from that slide before, a substantial number of Puerto Ricans, okay? And I think this is important to point out. I have a colleague, Michelle Ramos Pellicia, who's looking at MexiRicans in San Diego. But if you think about it, San Diego was about 90% Mexican, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that if you're a MexiRican and you live in a place where it's almost totally Mexican, that's probably going to be a different experience than if you're a MexiRican who lives in a place that's got a fair number of both groups. Does that make sense? Because that's where I'm heading, is to the MexiRicans. But before I get to the MexiRicans, I have to tell you about the Mexicans and the Puerto Ricans, okay? Let me tell you a little bit more about Chicago. Some scholars have argued that this is the only city in the U.S. where for over 50 years, so several generations, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans have lived together, worked together, and married each other, okay? So while it's true that New York is a very diverse place, y'all don't have a lot of Mexicans. They're starting to come now, right? Mexicans are, did you know this? Mexicans are the fastest growing Latino group in New York right now. Oh yeah, Queens is full of poblanos. All the people from Puebla are going to Queens. It's really, really interesting. So maybe 20 years from now, it'll be a different case. But right now, Chicago is the only place where Mexicans and Puerto Ricans have coexisted in large numbers for a long time, okay? So I think this is really interesting because we'll see in a minute, Mexican Spanish and Puerto Rican Spanish are very, very different, okay? Paco, I don't know if you've ever had your students look at the Ohio language files. No? Because this is the Mexican woman that they have, right? It's this great website. I can give you the URL if you're interested later, and you press on it and you see her. to hear an example of typical Mexican Spanish. And then this is the Puerto Rican guy, right? If you want to hear typical Puerto Rican Spanish, he's the guy on the Ohio website that you click on and he starts talking. And then you can hear how different they are, okay? Now, I did mention to you a moment ago that this was the breakdown in Chicago, right? I told you that it's about, of our Latinos, about 80% are Mexican, 10% are Puerto Rican. But check this out. What do you notice back in 1990? Sorry? From this side of the room. Estaban muy callados. Yes?
There was a much higher population of Puerto Ricans and a lower percentage of Mexicans.
That's right. The proportion was quite different, a little bit different, wasn't it? You had almost 20% of our local Latinos were Puerto Rican. Why is it significant? Because the people in my corpus grew up during this decade, during this time. So when they were growing up, forming linguistic attitudes, speaking to other people, right? We had a larger concentration of Puerto Ricans. I think that's important just to bring up to you. Now, when I tell people, yeah, I'm studying Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and MexiRicans in Chicago, the first thing they ask me is, don't they hate each other? Don't Mexicans and Puerto Ricans hate each other? In fact, if you Google it, why do Mexicans and Puerto Ricans hate each other? Strained relationships. Do they hate each other? Why do they hate each other? Etc. So this is a thing. This is a real thing. In fact, when I first moved to Chicago, I moved into a Puerto Rican, is anybody familiar with Logan Square? Logan Square, Humboldt Park, very Puerto Rican neighborhood. And I had just moved back from Mexico. I had a Mexican sticker, like on my car. And my neighbors were like, mija, tú tienes que quitar eso porque te van a rayar el carro, te van a hacer esto, te van a ponchar la llanta, te van a hacer de todo. And I was like, oh my God, where am I, right? So the minute I got there, it was this thing that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans hate each other. It's like West Side Story, you know? Now, some scholarship has been done on this. I'll be referring in a couple of slides here now to De Génova and Ramos Sayas' work. They looked at how these two groups understand and reproduce differences between each other, and they tried to link the way these groups look at each other to larger social frameworks of inequality. Okay, it's a really, really great book. I'll show it to you in a minute. And I'm going to use the word racialization here. And what I mean by racialization, what they mean by racialization, is when you discursively produce identities that ascribe a race-based meaning to a group of people. So it's when you say Mexicans do this, Puerto Ricans do that, Chinese people do this. Okay, that's called a racialization, okay? So what they found is that in addition to being racialized by the white majority, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans racialize each other, okay? Here's the things they said about each other. Puerto Ricans would say, oh, all those Mexicans are illegal. They steal our jobs, okay? They're too docile. They're backward. They're excessively traditional, right? These were the racializations that Puerto Ricans had of Mexicans. And what was the smack that the Mexicans were talking about the Puerto Ricans? They would say, oh, well, they're lazy. They're U.S. citizens, but they're on welfare. Okay? They don't maintain intact families. They get divorced all the time. They don't go to church. They're too loud. They're too brash. They're too crass. They're ghetto is the word that Mexicans would use. So do you see how these are kind of almost mirror images of each other in some ways? Okay? So you see these two groups articulating identities through discourses that distinguish each other through citizenship, participation in welfare, gender and family. I'll come back to gender in a moment, and perceived levels of modernity. Okay? The gendered study was done by Gina Perez. The title of this article is Mexicanas sufridas y puertorriqueñas rencorosas. And the main thrust of this, they interviewed, again, in Chicago. All this Mexican Puerto Rican scholarship has been done in Chicago for reasons that I think are by now pretty obvious, okay? She found that Puerto Rican women accused the Mexican women of being sufridas, right? Long suffering at the hands of abusive husbands, that they didn't know their rights, they didn't fight for their rights, they would just take it all, right? Yet the Mexican women in their defense would say, you know what? Patience and forgiveness are among our virtues. They were proud of this ability to aguantar. Okay? And then, what the Mexican women said about the Puerto Rican women, that they were too rencorosas. Okay? They'll just leave their man, they'll cut him, and then they'll leave him, and they don't care, they don't, they're not home cooking, they're not taking their children to school, they're not, right? A flip side of what the other criticism was. But the Puerto Rican women would say, no, you know what? We're independent, we're proud, nobody pushes us around and messes with us. Okay? So you're seeing these articulations of racialization coming out in very gendered ways as well. So this is what the two groups say about each other as people. what do they say about each other's Spanish? These two authors thought, okay, maybe these two groups clash, but they've got to perhaps come together when it comes to Spanish, don't they? They all speak Spanish, don't they? Spanish is going to make them a big happy family, right? No. Far from being a feature that unites them, it was a especially salient object around which to talk smack about each other again. Okay? So you have the first generation Mexicans expect that Mexicans of all generations know Spanish. If you're a third or fourth generation Mexican and you don't know Spanish, your grandma's mad. She's really mad about that, right? They expect this clinging to the Spanish language. They also think that Puerto Rican Spanish is inferior. The Mexicans that were interviewed for this project, okay? Unfortunately, many Puerto Ricans seem to have internalized this. Many Puerto Ricans here on the mainland and on the island will say, ay no, nuestro español es muy malo. They'll just, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans will come out and they will say this. And that's probably another discussion we can have about why they've internalized these attitudes, okay? Puerto Ricans also are less insistent on Spanish. You can be full up Boricua and not know any Spanish at all, okay? Whereas the Mexicans insist on more Spanish for Mexican identity, okay? Despite these differences, I will say this, and this is not a good thing. What brings Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, what they have in common is that they lose Spanish. They are shifting to Spanish. That first generation is dominant in Spanish. Maybe they learned some English. That second generation, who are my second generation people here? Okay. They tend to be bilingual in Spanish and English, but which language is stronger? English. And where are my third generation people? Okay. Third generation people, if they get any Spanish at all, we consider it very fortunate. This is called language shift. And as they say, shift happens. That's funny, but it's not. But it's not funny, right? Because it's about losing language and shifting to English. Okay? So that's what these two groups have in common. And I, in fact, documented this among a bunch of high school students in Chicago. By the way, let me point out to the linguists in the crowd, to understand the why behind certain linguistic uses, we really do need to go to other toolboxes, right? We need to turn to Latino studies. We need to turn to sociology, anthropology. Here's the cover of that book I just mentioned. These folks are not linguists. They have an excellent chapter on the Spanish language, but they're not linguists. So I think it's a good idea for us to have these conversations with each other, okay? Gina Perez also is an anthropologist. So, lest you go away thinking, oh my God, these groups are killing each other on the street, it's not like that, and I'll point out that in a minute. And we do see signs of collaboration. So you probably heard in 2001 there was huge demonstrations for immigration reform. Okay? Puerto Ricans don't need to be doing that. They're citizens. But yet they did. They turned out in support of their Mexican brothers and sisters to fight for immigration reform. That was documented in this book here. Anybody been to the Puerto Rican parade in New York? Here? Yeah? Been to in Puerto Rico? You have? The Mexican parade in Chicago? Anybody been there? No? Okay. Is there a Mexican parade here? Probably not yet. There will be. Eventually. What you're finding at these parades, when you used to go to the Puerto Rican parade, it was a sea of Puerto Rican flags. That's all you saw. When you went to the Mexican parade on the south side, it's a sea of Mexican flags. That was all you saw. Guess what you see now? You see Mexican flags at the Puerto Rican parade, and you see Puerto Rican flags. And it's not a sign of like throwing gang signs or anything. It's, yay, huepa, we're here, right? So we do see signs of this collaboration, okay? Now here's a big drawback to the De Genova y Ramos-Saya study that I just mentioned to you. They only interviewed first-generation Mexicans, first and second-generation Puerto Ricans. What about the second and third generation? Like, are things staying this way among second and third generation people, or are they changing? So that's what I decided to do. I interviewed first and second and third generation speakers about these questions. I found a lot of the same smack that they were talking, but guess what? It changed across generations. The first generation, this scale here is negative attitudes. Negative attitudes. First generation, extremely negative. Puerto Ricans hating Mexicans, Mexicans hating Puerto Ricans. But look at this. Second generation goes down considerably. And look at this. And the third generation, people are getting along a lot better. So that's why I say the idea of Mexicans and Puerto Ricans not getting along is overblown. It's overblown. You see it in the first generation. These generations say, oh yeah, I've heard that, but I don't think it's true. Or they say, yeah, I've heard that, but I have evidence, I have counter evidence that that's not true. My girlfriend's Mexican, my boyfriend's Puerto Rican, right? They would start to tell you that these things were not, so these frictions appear to be largely restricted to the immigrant generation. That's the good news. Okay? What about linguistically? What do they say about each other's Spanish? First generation says, oh, no. Mexican Spanish is fine, the Puerto Ricans say. And then the Mexicans say, oh, yeah, Puerto Rican Spanish, it's just another kind of Spanish. It's totally fine. Okay? The second again, remember, this is negative attitudes. Second generation says, oh, my God, Mexican Spanish is terrible. Oh, my God, Puerto Rican Spanish is horrible. You see the spike in negative attitudes. Then you come back to the third generation. Once again, everybody's chill. Everybody's like, oh, yeah, Spanish is good. No problem. Nothing wrong with that. Okay? So I asked myself, why? Why would this be? And I came up with a reason, maybe during question and answer, if you have a reason, potential reason, I'd like to hear it. My sense is that the first generation, they are secure, linguistically secure with their Spanish. Remember that they immigrated after the age of what? 12. So they're secure in their Spanish. They don't mind if you speak it differently. They don't feel a need to criticize you, right? Second generation, what do we say about them? What's their stronger language? English. So there's some insecurity about their Spanish, all right? So when you're insecure, that's when you lash out and criticize the other guy, right? And what did we say about these G3s? If they have any Spanish at all, it's like, ay, gracias a Dios. So when they hear somebody else speaking Spanish, whether it's Mexican, Puerto Rican, Ecuadorian, no importa, they're like, no, pues, o sea, no sienten con el derecho de criticar el español del otro. Does that make sense? Really? Because that's what I propose. I don't know, maybe. Maybe it makes sense. Anyway. Right. So what I see is that the negative attitudes towards the people, the negative social attitudes, does not correlate with the negative linguistic attitude, so it kind of looks like that, which is kind of interesting. Kind of interesting. Okay, now we're going to get into the linguistic stuff. I showed them these pictures. We got any Mexicans in the house? Mexicans, raise your hand. All right, where's my Boricuas? I did not separate them. I swear I did not make them sit separately. Okay, Mexicans, you would call this a naranja, right? And you would call that habichuelas. Frijoles. You'd call that a chupón, etc. Mis Boricuas, China, habichuela, and bobo. Right? So these are words that are typically referred to by Puerto Ricans with this word and by Mexicans with this word. Okay? So what you do is you show first, second, and third generation, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, MexiRicans, these pictures. You don't put the words there. You just show them the pictures. And you say, ¿con qué palabra conoce usted esta cosa? Right? If they say to you, eso es un guineo, then you give them 2 points under Puerto Rican. Okay? If you then say, ¿conoce usted otra palabra? And they say, pues también le dicen plátano. Then you give them 1 point for Mexican. Does that make sense? If they say, no, I don't know any other word, I just call it a guineo, then all they got was the 2 points here and 0 points for Mexicans. Does that make sense? Okay, so when you add up all their points, you give them a Puerto Rican score, you give them a Mexican score. Okay? Now you might ask yourself, wait a minute, does this really reflect what they know in their brains, what they really use the most? That's a good question. To what extent does this activity really reflect on their lexicon? Okay? Aren't there interviewer effects? If you're a Mexican and you just sat with me and I'm Mexican and we just talked for an hour about your nightmares and your dreams and da-da-da-da, and then I give you those pictures, we've just been like super Mexican for like an hour. Maybe you're going to bust out all your Mexican, like I've activated your Mexican, right? But what if I was Puerto Rican and I was interviewing you for an hour? You might be like, I'm going to impress this Puerto Rican lady and I'm going to bust out my Puerto Rican, right? So there could be interviewer effects. That's why I say this is not perfect, okay? However, I will tell you this. There was variation. The same person would sometimes offer a Puerto Rican word first and sometimes a Mexican word first. So that tells me, you know what? Maybe they really are telling me the word that comes to their mind first, right? Now, does the word that comes to your mind first, is that really the word that you use the most in your life? Don't know. We don't know. These authors suggest that it might be. Okay? That's all we know. It might be. Okay? And many of the people who I said, ¿por qué usted dijo China first and naranja second? They would say, pues eso es lo que yo digo. They themselves said that it was the word they used first. So I've given you my caveats. Now I'm going to show you what I found. Okay? What did I predict? I predicted that Puerto Ricans are going to know more Mexican words than vice versa. Why would I predict that? Number prevalence, we already saw that there's more Mexicans than Puerto Ricans. Why else? One more reason. What did we say about how people view Puerto Rican Spanish? Both Puerto Ricans and other people. Estigmatizado. Puerto Rican Spanish is more stigmatized. So that might be a reason why the Puerto Ricans would more quickly learn Mexican words, and Mexicans would be like, I ain't learning those words. Those words are stigmatized, okay? I also predicted that you would learn more of the other guy's words as the generation went on. So first generation, I predicted they're not going to know any words from the other guy. Second generation is going to know more words from the other guys. Third generation is going to know the most words from the other guy. Why would I think that third generation is going to know more words from the other group?
Because they were the ones who didn't really know Spanish, so they were just picking up what they could get.
Picking up what they can get, and what else? Where did they get their Spanish from? Yeah?
Well, they don't have the same social ideologies about, or like linguistic ideologies about things, so they don't care what they
I didn't even think of that. Oh my God. I didn't even think of that. That they're less negatively predisposed. Where were you? You know what? I might be in time to change that. Can I steal that? Put it in my book? I didn't even think of that. There's another reason. Don't go away afterwards because you have to tell me that again. There's another reason. Who do these people get their Spanish from? Who talks to them in Spanish?
Their grandparents.
Their grandparents probably. But can we assume that their parents may be speaking some Spanish to them too? And their parents, we said, are going to know more of the other guys, right? They've sort of been in Chicago longer, you could say, generationally long. Does that make sense? Now, you're not buying that as much. You're buying hers better. Hers is better. I think her reason's better. First thing you have to do, though, is you got to take these pictures down to Mexico and down to Puerto Rico, don't you? Because what happens if everybody in Mexico knows the Puerto Rican words and everybody in Puerto Rico knows the Mexican words? Then your experiment is a big fat fail, isn't it? So I took one for the team, bit the bullet, made the sacrifice, went down, did some data collection. Here's what I found. They scored the maximum score on their own vocabulary. So everybody in Mexico named the Mexican one first and got their 20 points, right? Everybody in Puerto Rico named, so in group for a Puerto Rican is Puerto Rican, in group for a Mexican is Mexican. Does that make sense? So out group for the Mexican is Puerto Rican. They know nothing. Mexicans in Mexico don't know any Puerto Rican words. Puerto Rican out group, i.e. Mexican vocabulary, look at that. Puerto Ricans on the island know more Mexican words than vice versa. Why do Puerto Ricans on the island know more Mexican words?
Univision.
Univision, el factor novela. Las telenovelas, right? There are a lot of media, a lot of news, novelas, películas. When stuff is dubbed, it comes out of Mexico. So they're getting a lot of exposure to Mexican Spanish. Mexicans, they never ever hear Puerto Rican Spanish in Mexico, okay? So, great. Now let's go to Chicago. Right next to the Chicago first, second, third generation, I'm going to put the homeland people so that you can just compare it. What do we see here? What happens to their knowledge of Mexican words? Jumps up. What happens to their knowledge, Mexican knowledge, let me back up. This is out group. This is how well do you know the other guy's words, okay? This was how well Mexican homeland knows Puerto Rican, how well Puerto Rican homeland knows Mexican, right? Here's Chicago, G1, G2, G3. What do you think? Is this evidence of dialect contact? Are they more familiar with out-group lexicon in Chicago than they are in the homeland? Yes! You love when your hypothesis is borne out by your data. What was my second prediction about generation? What did I predict? G3 would know more outgroup than G2, and G2 would know more outgroup than G1, right? Here's what I found. Here's the outgroup. Here's knowing the other guy. Here's how much G1 Mexicans know of the other guy, G1 Puerto Ricans. Here's G2 Mexicans, G2 Puerto Ricans. Here's G3 Mexicans, G3 Is my hypothesis sustained? No. My hypothesis is not sustained, okay? What's going on? Why do you think these G3s just, yeah?
Maybe it goes along the same lines as they're lucky to know anything.
Yeah, because they don't know any words, period. Right, exactly. Their Spanish has declined so precipitously that they don't even know their own in-group stuff, much less the other guy's stuff, right? So there's that hypothesis. So that was the lexical stuff. Now I think I have time to move on to the phonological stuff. That's how we produce things. All right, I need a Mexican volunteer, please. Si no hay voluntarios, habrá víctimas. There we go. You're going to be my Mexican. Who's going to be my Boricua? All right, here we go. 2 women. Excellent. Coda S. This means the S at the end. I won't say what it is. I'm just going to say coda S. I'm going to ask my Mexican speaker to please read this nice and loudly.
Después los muchachos salen.
Did you hear that? Do it again.
Después los muchachos salen.
Okay, now my Boricua. Nice and loud.
Después los muchachos salen.
Do it again.
Después los muchachos salen.
Ooh, what was different between the Mexican and the Puerto Rican one? Yes.
They dropped the S in the code at the end.
Aha, so she said, después los muchachos salen. And she said what? Después lo muchacho. Did she drop this S too? No, she didn't say Allen. She said salen. So it's the S where?
In the coda.
And what does coda mean?
Coda means the last sound in a particular sound group. So if it's CVC, that's the last C in that is called the coda. It gets dropped by the Puerto Rican Spanish.
Paco, is she your student? That explains it. Let's, for the lay people, for the normal people, let's say that this is at the end of a syllable. At the end of a syllable. They weaken their S. Let's call it weakening their S. Okay. What about this sound right here? Let's have my Mexican say this out loud, nice and loud, please.
Ramón se rió en el carro.
Otra vez.
Ramón se rió en el carro.
Ramón se rió en el carro. All right. Now this sometimes works and sometimes it doesn't. How about my Boricua?
Ramón se rió en el carro.
Do it again.
Ramón se rió en el carro.
She speaks a prestigious variety of Puerto Rican Spanish. Does anybody know how other Puerto Ricans might pronounce this sentence? Some of my other Boricuas? No? Jamón se rió en el cajo. So what happened to that? It moved from up here to, where is it? Back here, right, it's velar. It's not quite uvular. I kind of overdid it. I made it sound uvular, but it's velar, right? So, jamón se rió en el cajo. So, right, even if you don't speak Spanish, when you hear those two, you go, oh my God, they're so different, aren't they? All right, here's what I did. I took a bunch of Puerto Ricans who were interviewed by Puerto Ricans, a bunch of Puerto Ricans who were interviewed by Mexicans. I took a bunch of Mexicans interviewed by, wait, that's wrong. Mexican same should be Mexican, shouldn't it? You didn't see that. And then Mexican different would be Puerto Rican. Does that make sense? Different means opposite from you, okay? What do I predict? Puerto Ricans will start to say después. They'll start to put those S's in there when they're speaking with Mexicans. Why? What we said before. There's more Mexicans around, and because Puerto Rican Spanish is what? More stigmatized, okay? Mexicans won't change. They don't care. Mexicans are not going to start saying, los muchachos, la la la. No. They're not going to start to imitate the Puerto Ricans. Imitate's not the right word. It would be accommodate, okay? And I also thought Puerto Ricans would sound less Puerto Rican-like with each generation, okay? Here's what I found with S. If you're a Mexican, talking with a Mexican, you do very little weakening. Whether you're talking with a Mexican, when you're talking with a Puerto Rican, or when you're talking with a Mexican, very little change there. That's what I expected, right? Mexicans aren't going to change. They don't care if you're Mexican or you're Puerto Rican. They're going to say los muchachos, right? What about my Puerto Ricans? Do they look different when they're talking with a Mexican versus a Puerto Rican? Do they look different? No. No, they don't. Look at that. 58, 57, same thing. Puerto Ricans will not change their S realizations whether you're Mexican or Puerto Rican. That does not change. What about R, however? Look at that. It did not reach significance, but you do see, I mean, look at that. I can't believe that wasn't statistically significant. I hate stats sometimes. They will soltar la ja, jamón se ríe en el cajo when they're speaking with other boricuas. But when they're speaking with Mexicans, Ramón se rió en el carro. What does that tell you about this variable? How is this variable different from the S? This probably tells me that this variable is more stigmatized than the S. Even on the island of Puerto Rico, somebody says, jamón se rió en el cajo, the Boricuas are even like, damn, he's got a stigmatized accent, right? That's a very stigmatized feature. Okay. Were there any changes over generation among the Puerto Ricans like I had predicted? No. Then I asked myself, if you use S and you use R, you know what, I'm going to skip the S and R. That's kind of cool, and my mind was blown, but I think I have to keep going. So we have these tensions and negative stereotypes, as we saw earlier, that are decreasing. So we don't have this anymore in Chicago, right? We have something more like this, don't we? Mexicans and Puerto Ricans are starting to get along. So under these conditions, if you are a MexiRican, I have not defined a MexiRican yet. What is a MexiRican? What do you think a MexiRican is? Here, I'll show you what a MexiRican is. Can I get my... You remember that this was the prototypical Mexican lady and this was the prototypical Puerto Rican guy, right? So, hang on. I won't show you, but I'll explain to you. Fast forward. That's a MexiRican. You got the picture? Right? So the mere existence of MexiRicans means that some of these folks are getting along, if you catch my meaning, right? Now, is this common? I did a Google search, and yeah, we got Columbia-Ricans, Cubadorians, Dominicans, Guatexicans, Guatemaltecans. Anybody hear something like this? Yeah? What are you? Columbia-Rican. Yeah?
Cuban-Rican.
Cuba-Rican.
Yeah.
I love it. You know what? You're Columbia-Rican? Maybe that's why she didn't veolarize her R's. Right? That's going to be that's what I'm going to guess. Who is your mom or your dad Puerto Rican?
They both grew up in Puerto Rico, but my dad's Colombian.
Oh, so your mom's the Boricua. Does she say jamón cejillo en el cajo? A little bit. See? We got to talk later. Okay. So this is my question. If you are raised, right, listening to jamón cejillo en el cajo from your mom and Ramón cejillo en el carro from your dad, what in the heck are you going to do with your Spanish, right? That's kind of where I'm going with this. So I'm sort of wondering, basically, my question is, can you be bi-dialectal? Can you speak two different dialects, right? It depends on how you define dialect, okay? I'm going to play you a really quick example of something that's bi-dialectal, I think is bi-dialect. You ever watch Key and Peele?
Because you're my wife, and you love the theater, and it's your birthday. Great. Unfortunately, the orchestra is already filled up, but they do have seats that are still left in the dress circle. So if you want me to get them theater tickets right now, I'm gonna do it right now.
What's up, dog? I'm about 5 minutes away.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool. No, they're all good singers. They're all good singers.
Yeah, son. Nah, man. I'm telling you, man. I'm about to cross the street.
No, they get that one dude in it that you love, man. He gonna be in it. Yeah.
Come on, man. You know I'm almost there, all right?
Right. No, I'm gonna pick your ass up at 6:30. Then. Cool. All right. Yeah. The parking's free. So they got that.
Oh my God, Christian, I almost totally just got mugged right now.
Right? So, why did he change the way he was speaking? Did you notice some of the features he was doing differently? He was doing some copula deletion, his phonology, his intonation change. Why did he do that? Yeah?
Because he didn't want to seem less flat in front of another individual.
Right, exactly. And then this guy did the same thing, didn't he? The way he was speaking when this guy was in earshot is not the way that he would normally speak, right? So I wonder, do MexiRicans speak Mexican with Mexicans, and do they speak Puerto Rican with Puerto Ricans, right? I can't answer that question. I can't answer that question because I would have to interview them twice, once with the Mexican and once with the Puerto Rican. I did not do that. What I did do was have the hour-long interviews and analyze the interviews for their features and then ask them, hey, does your Spanish change when you talk to other people? So here's what I found. I got 71 MexiRicans, okay? If you've been to Chicago, you know there's a north side, south side, huge thing, okay? I made sure they were evenly distributed between north side and south side, okay? Almost all of them were able to identify the negative stereotypes, right? Oh yeah, they say Puerto Ricans are this and they say Mexicans are that, but they themselves did not embrace any of that. So it's almost like that stuff gets erased when it's both in there. Okay, I gave them the same task over here, okay? And here was my prediction, that there would be a correlation between your mother and what words you use. Why do you think I would make that prediction?
Because your mother is normally the one who talks to you the most throughout your childhood and normally be the one who teaches you the language as you're growing up.
Is it because women talk more than men?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. some statistics indicate that we do actually talk more than men, but you've identified something very important. Child care inequities. Women tend to be the one engaged in child care for longer periods of time than men. Also, there is a role of the mother, it seems. There's a little bit of research out there that suggests, like there was these families from Japan that moved to England. If the dad was Japanese, the kids did not learn Japanese in England. If the mom was Japanese, those kids learned Japanese in England. And we've got several different language groups and countries where that is the case. Here's what I found. The Mexican, this looks like it's a difference, but it's not significant. This ended up being significant. If your mom is Puerto Rican, you know more Puerto Rican vocabulary. Get it? So I found a mom effect, but only for Puerto Rican vocabulary, which kind of makes sense, because the Puerto Rican one we said is the minority one, right? So if you're going to get that Puerto Rican Spanish in there, it has to come from mom. Okay, that's what I found. Also, those who, well, that's kind of the same thing in a different way. So having a Puerto Rican mother is necessary but not sufficient. Necessary but not sufficient to have a dominant Puerto Rican lexicon. Okay, a lot of people had Puerto Rican moms, but they were dominant in Mexican words, right? But if you were dominant in Puerto Rican words, you had a Puerto Rican mom. That was hands down what I found. Okay, how about how they sound? I did the same things with the S and the R. Here's what I found. If your mom is Puerto Rican, you weaken the S, you say lo muchacho después, right? Un poquito más que if your mom is Mexican. But guess what? That was not statistically significant. But just because something is not statistically significant does not mean that it's not interesting. Okay? But here's something that's even more interesting. I looked at each individual. So this is group stuff. Group stuff hides stuff. If you just report on groups, you might be missing something. So here's what I did. The people who said lo muchacho, who weakened their S's 60% or more, there was 5 people. Yeah? Guess what all 5 of those people had in common? Wild guess. Puerto Rican mother. So there is a mother factor, again, for the phonology. Okay? R, we see the same thing. If your mom is Puerto Rican, you're going to do jamón cejillo en el cajo. Más que si tu mamá es mexicana, but that was not significant. Again, this is group stuff. Group numbers hide stuff. If you break it down, 9 of the 12 velarizations were realized by people who had a mother who was Puerto Rican. Okay, do you want to hear? Let's see. I'm not going to go through here. I don't want to have time to do that. I got to get to the identity stuff. Let's get to the identity stuff. Right. So overall, of all these 71 MexiRicans, almost 80%, when you listen to their Spanish, they sound either Mexican or Puerto Rican. They sound one or the other. Again, do I have evidence whether they can sound like the other one? That they didn't sound like? No, I don't have that evidence. Okay, because I didn't do them twice. However, they claimed, all of them said, I am equally Mexican and Puerto Rican. Do not ask me which one I feel more of. I get asked that all the time, and I will not choose. I am equally Mexican and Puerto Rican. However, the second they open their mouth, they mark themselves. How can you say that you're Puerto Rican cuando tú dices que los muchachos fueron al cine y sa, 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 right? So what happens is that Puerto Ricans will be like, tú no eres boricua, tú no suenas boricua, right? And on the same token, when they say, I'm equally Mexican and Puerto Rican, and then they say, pero tú sabes, yo quiero que tú me vengas a verme, pero tú no eres mexicano, tú no suenas nada mexicano. Right? So they claim this dualness, but they only sound one or the other. And they get a lot of flack for this from people. Check out what this young man said. My Mexican family says, oh, the Puerto Rican's here. Don't talk to me with that accent. Que gacho. He's Mexican. When I was a little boy, I was at my Mexican aunt's house. It was my cousin's birthday. I'm the Puerto Rican. And I said, Titi, quiero un pedazo de bizcocho con una cuchara al lado. And she cracked me across the mouth. Because bizcocho is a nasty word in Mexican Spanish that refers to female anatomy, okay? After that, I was always worried about what I said to people, right? So from a young age, this guy is made to feel he's othered, right, by his own family, okay? What does this remind you of? A lot of my MexiRican female women said, my Puerto Rican Spanish comes out when I'm angry. Cuando yo me enojo, sale lo boricua, dicen. Coño, ¿qué te pasa? What does that remind you of? Does it remind you of what we saw before, that Gina Perez study with the Puerto Ricanas rencorosas? And the Mexicanas más, right? Another person said, güey will slip out with my friends, but never with my Puerto Rican cousins. You know Mexicans say güey all the time? ¿verdad? Sometimes when I'm with my Mexican friends, I want to emphasize that I'm also Puerto Rican so that they can see that being Puerto Rican is not a bad thing, okay? They also have phenotypical issues. They'll say that some people can change their phenotype quite drastically, but for the most part, the way you look is the way you look, okay? I'm not arguing that MexiRicans are necessarily mixed race, but I started looking at the literature on mixed race, and it really helped me theorize these groups. They get asked all the time, what are you? What are you? And then they're exposed to a lookism, right? They said Puerto Ricans have curly hair. Puerto Ricans look this way. One woman got told, you know, you look Mexican, but you have a Puerto Rican butt. So they're being assigned a category, they're being essentialized via their phenotype. So that's what we call lookism. And by the way, they sound, which I made up a word, I call it soundism. Okay? So they're experiencing lookism and soundism by people who want to put them in one box. They want to say you're this or you're that. Okay? Same thing happens with Spanish and English here. Have you ever heard somebody say, oh, you don't speak Spanish, you speak Spanglish. You have to keep them separate and pure. No. That's not how languages work. That's not how people work. So these people are embodying a doubleness, okay? So I think what I'm going to do is just point out really quickly two more things. Flags. You see these hanging in rearview mirrors everywhere, right? Now you can buy one that's got a half Boricua flag and a half Mexican flag. Okay, this is totally a thing now. Also tattoos. These are all, this is not me, by the way. This is all over the internet, these tattoos that people have. I almost got in an accident taking this picture in Chicago, MexiRican. So this is people embrace an identity as MexiRican, okay? The issue that I get is I'm not Mexican enough for the Mexicans, I'm not Puerto Rican enough for the Puerto Ricans, and I'm going to end with this quote. This is my favorite quote in the entire book. Una muchacha, y nunca lo voy a olvidar, que ella me dijo, si yo te corto, ¿va a salir salsa o sofrito? If I cut you, will you bleed? Salsa, which is a Mexican condiment, or sofrito, which is a Puerto Rican condiment. So this friend of his is pushing him. He keeps saying, no, que yo soy los dos. And she kept pushing him and no, what are you really? What are you really? And she tried to essentialize him through his body and a metaphor to food. And I thought that was particularly significant because everybody mentioned food. Que mi mamá prepara tostones con chilaquiles. Like something super Mexican and something super Puerto Rican. And again, the mother. This is gendered work, gendered ethnic identity work. So, in summary, most of these MexiRicans sound either Mexican or Puerto Rican. Some claim that they can style shift, but most of them say, no, I try to sound Puerto Rican, but then Monday slips through. You know, Puerto Ricans always say Monday? Monday? Monday would always slip through. They claim that they are equally both, and but their language underlying it tends to subject them to a kind of soundism that other people don't like. And so they live this sort of dual existence. So I think I'll stop here, and I'll see if you have any thoughts or questions. Thank you. And please don't go away. I really meant it. I want to hear more about your what you said earlier. Any thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Do you think, based on anecdotal evidence or systematic research you've done, that social performance is different from social media performance in reference to both the linguistic aspect of identification and self-identification and the performative aspect, the value-based or content-based identification?
I'm sorry, I think I'm...
So, is this equally evident in real life and online? Or people self-identify or perform differently in the social media? Do you have
I don't see, no. Okay, when I Google MexiRican, it comes up everywhere. People have it on their Facebook. My name is MexiRican. They have the tattoos. I mean, in the sense to which that is an enactment of a social identity, it's definitely there in social media. I didn't really see anything that contradicted, like what I saw in social media that was strongly contradicted in my 71 interviews at all. But I can't really speak to the extent to which they overlap. People would have to tell their stories on social media for me to make that connection, I think. But my sense is what I see online is that this is a real identity that people seek to enact, for sure. That they are equally both, yeah. Yeah, Agnes?
Well, first of all, I think this is really wonderful stuff. study. It is sociolinguistic. It goes down to specific structural features and connecting language and ideology and identity. So thank you. My question has to do with this connection that's being made between language and identity. When people say, well, I think your title is I'm both.
Soy los dos,
Yeah,
right?
soy dos. I'm two. Now, what do people mean by that? Does it mean that we have to be speaking 50% of the time in one style and 50% of the time as other? And also take into consideration language is only one of the many semiotic tools in which we perform our identity. It could be that I'm wearing Puerto Rican type of clothing but speaking a Mexican Spanish,
Right.
and that makes me 50-50, I'm both.
Right.
So there are many levels that utterance could be taken.
Yes.
Perhaps this is it's not a challenge to a study, but just to say that perhaps there isn't really a one-on-one correspondence between the actual utterances we observe on particular given moments and the claim on identity. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I tried to address this in the book. So soy las dos could mean I'm 50-50. And some people would use this discourse of I'm half and half. But that doesn't mean that you have to speak half the time. So the language is divorced from the claim. Because as I mentioned, they all claim that they're both. But the majority of them also are monodialectal. So they are saying, yo soy mexicano y hablando con un acento puertorriqueño. Right? They're claiming that. But does soy los dos mean I am fully Mexican and I am fully Puerto Rican, or does it mean that I'm some sort of hybrid? Like, what does it really mean to be both of something, right? That's not something that I can speak to. I just have that quote. But there was another part to your question.
About the role language plays in actually doing the identity.
Doing the identity work, right? When they're making this claim, hey, if they're around a bunch of Puerto Ricans and they say, I'm Mexican too, I'm Mexican, and their Spanish sounds Mexican, right? Then that claim, it can do identity work in getting you sort of believed that you are that. But it also very frequently does identity work in that they get challenged, right? So they have these mono-ethnic friends and family members, like L.O., whose family, right, says, his Mexican family says, you're not Mexican. And his Puerto Rican family says, you're not Puerto Rican. So he's othered by both of them, right? His Spanish is straight up Boricua. He was he was rated as sounding the most Puerto Rican of everybody. And even then, his Puerto Rican family kind of doesn't accept him entirely. So it does some work gaining you acceptance into the group that you sound like, but it does an equal amount of work, maybe even more work, right, in getting you challenged. And they're constantly having to defend their claim that they are equally both. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So all these Generation 3 people are Spanish speakers. Did you measure to what degree they're Spanish speakers? Did you look at people who are not Spanish speakers but would still claim this?
That's an excellent question. When I put out the call for participants, I said you have to be able to talk to me in Spanish. Even if we have to switch to English a lot, that's fine. I want you to, right? I did end up, let's see, why did I end up? Oh, I know why. When I first started the project, the interviews were in English. And there was a portion in the end that was a Spanish activity. This has some pictures and to tell a story. So among that group, I did get 5 individuals who spoke 0 Spanish, but who were MexiRican. And I haven't gone in to look at what they say, right?
Or how they claim that
How
identity.
do they enact that identity as Mexican? Like language, obviously, the Spanish language is doing no work for them at all, positive or negative, right, to help them enact that identity. But since there was only 5 out of the 71, in fact, it wasn't the 71, it was 76. Right, but that would be a great thing, would be to go around and look at G3 and even G2 folks whose Spanish is very weak or non-existent.
Because there must be a lot of them.
Indeed.
As you said.
Indeed, yeah. But since I was looking at Spanish, I tried to get those who could speak Spanish, right? Yeah.
So I know you did this in Chicago because there's more Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, significant enough. Would you ever consider doing a project where you took from every state that has a significant population of Mexican or Puerto Rican, see how all their Spanish is from different coasts and different states and everything, compare to each other to see like how maybe living in different areas, like one living in the West Coast adopts more West Coast things and East Coast and whatever, to see how they all kind of because even English, your dialects are, English dialects are completely different from where you live. So you
Right.
have words for different things, even though you're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
So have you ever considered doing something like that?
As soon as I get an NSF grant and a big team, you can join my team. No, and that's I mentioned very briefly at the beginning. My friend Michelle Ramos Pellicia is looking at MexiRicans in San Diego, but over there, it's the Mexican concentration is even larger. So it would be a good idea for us to sit down and sort of compare. We'd have to be using the same instruments though, and doing kind of the same things. But I think it's a very tenable hypothesis that a MexiRican in New York is going to look very different in a lot of ways than a MexiRican in Chicago, right? Because here it's almost flipped, right? The Mexicans are the minority, the total minority. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so we'll go 1, 2.
I was just wondering if from the group of people you interviewed, how many of them may come in looking like, as you said, like lookism, and their soundism being completely opposite of each other. Because I've been told throughout my life, you look like this, but you sound like this, and so has several members of my family because I am half and half.
Right.
So.
See, she used the words half and half too. Okay, that's a really good question. I didn't start to theorize this whole issue of lookism and soundism until, hindsight's 20/20. If I could, I would go back and take photographs of every person, and I would ask them to describe that photograph and what people have said about them. Not everybody talked about lookism. So this wasn't one of my variables that I studied. I just sort of stumbled. It kept coming up in the interviews, even though we didn't ask about it, right? It just kept coming up among men and women, right? Some of the men would say, when I give myself a real tight fade, then they think I'm Puerto Rican. When I let my hair grow a little bit, then they think I'm Mexican, right? And the girls would talk about if I leave my hair curly, they think I'm Puerto Rican, right? All these different, hair was very, very significant. In the summer, when I get tanner, people think I'm this or that, right? So no, I don't have enough data on that to do a real connection between what people are told they look, the lookism and the soundism, basically. I do have a couple people who came right out and said, as if trying to hit me over the head, hey, you should study this. A mí me dicen que I look Puerto Rican, but I sound Mexican, or vice versa. Yeah. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your talk. I kept having this question in my mind about what happened if you introduce social class as a way of analyzing these results, because it's going to be very, very different when you have somebody with college education teaching Spanish to their children, and when you have somebody that is basically migrated here with a primary education. And the same thing with, we know that Puerto Ricans internally are very divided also by race.
Right.
And Mexicans tend to have this concept of we are a cosmic race, we are as a mixed race, and even though there's still like native populations that are very much separated from the north.
Indeed.
So to what degree these categories that you have constructed really, of Puerto Ricans and Mexicans are some kind of a simplification of a much more complex scenario that would give us very different results.
Right. Those are two huge questions. Y me quedé con la segunda y se me olvidó la primera. Class.
Race and class.
Class, I'm going to argue, and we could talk more about this later.
Because you include some gender in that.
Yeah. This is a largely homogeneous working class population. My sense is that class does not play a role in this corpus. I think you're right, it could, but my corpus is largely, you might have some that you would consider solidly middle class. They themselves are, their parents were not, but they've managed to kind of, right? I've got an equal split of those who had some college and those who did not have college. If you look at the income by census tract, by the zip code where they grew up, which I did, this is a largely working class corpus, with some small exceptions that I think are pretty marginal. So, class I don't think is an issue. It is true that Puerto Rican and Mexican as national concepts are invented. The Spanish language as a concept does not exist. Society knows what is considered Spanish and English, but the brain doesn't, right? It's all about features. Okay, so yes, it's true. I am using socially constructed, I didn't construct them, right? But I'm using socially constructed categories. Interestingly, I thought I would find a lot more anti-black racism among the Mexicans towards the Puerto Ricans, but the Puerto Ricans expressed a lot, and here now I'm talking about when the parents, like what did your grandparents say when your parents got together, right? The Puerto Rican grandparents were equally vehemently as opposed when the Mexican was of any kind of indigenous, had any indigeneity sort of either visibly or otherwise present in them. So you're right, both groups have these internal sort of colonial and racial things going on. But your question is a larger one that I can't really answer. So to what extent is my use, I think what you're saying is, to what extent is my use of socially constructed categories not blinding me, right, to certain aspects of their experience? It could very well be. And my questions certainly assume your mother is Mexican, your father is Puerto Rican. I mean, but they also speak in those terms. They're really not very postmodern, these young people. So this is how they see the world. So I think it's maybe okay that I've used these socially constructed categories with them because they themselves use them. But you're right. If I were to do a flip on this, I might see some very different things. You're absolutely right. Yes?
So I was just wondering, if G3 was living with G1 and G2, would that influence some kind of thing?
Absolutely. I did not study this with any rigor, but typically when you have a G3 who's got strong Spanish, abuela was in the house. It's the abuela factor. Absolutely. Having an abuela, the amount of travel to the country of origin, spending every summer in a rancho, that helps. Having abuela in the house absolutely helps as well. And there were some people, so your mom was Mexican, your Spanish sounded straight up, no, actually that didn't happen. Your mom would be Puerto Rican, your Spanish sounded Mexican, but your Mexican abuela was in the house. So that can absolutely happen. And you might think that neighborhood would have an influence. I'll just bring this up because I didn't really have time. The north side is where the Boricuas are. There's like no Boricuas hardly on the south side. That's all Mexican, okay? Mexicans are starting to come up and dilute the Puerto Rican concentration on the north side, okay? But you would think that a Mexican growing up on the north side, surrounded by a bunch of Puerto Ricans, might sound more Puerto Rican, but they don't tend to, right? And the reason for that is, when you're born and raised in Chicago, you don't speak Spanish with your friends. What do you speak with your friends? English. So peers are not really influencing your Spanish. It's the elder, your parents, your tíos y tías, y los viejos de la vecindad. That's it. Those are the only people you're speaking Spanish with. We probably have time for one more question. Ya rugen las panzas, ¿verdad? Ya les estoy escuchando. Yeah, Paco.
I have a question about do you expect to have to create a new variety of Spanish? The question about thinking about the Spanish in New York, the work that they did about having certain properties of Caribbean Spanish with respect to the possibility of not having the overt subject,
right,
the subject all the time, and Mexicans does so some sort of hybridity of
No. So if you don't know the work that Paco's referring to, there's a seminal, very, very important study done in New York City. 6 different groups, Latino groups, so like 3 of them were Caribbean, 3 of them were mainland, okay? And you probably know that in Spanish you can drop the pronoun. You can say boy, or you can say yo voy, right? Caribbeans tend to say yo voy, tú vas, y él va, yo, él, tú, ella. They're like pronouns all day long, right? And mainlanders, so Mexicans, Colombians, Venezuelans, they tend to drop, they don't say it. They say boy, vas, va, okay? What happens when they come and they live together? Well, what they found in that study, and I think I'm getting this right, is this part being recorded? Because if you play it back and I got it wrong, I'll be embarrassed. Was that the one group, they started moving towards each other, but the mainlanders were moving more because they're outnumbered by the Caribbeans. I think that's right, okay? So the question is, that's kind of like a hybridized thing that's happening, right? Everybody has changed. And you call it New York City Spanish now, right? Even though there's still lugar de origen differences, right? So he's asking me, wouldn't you have expected something similar in Chicago? Maybe, but the thing is, Spanish is fleeing, right? We know that it's being lost. It doesn't hang around long enough for a new variety to crystallize. It's like, unfortunately, it's like you're taking a diagnosis on a dying patient. Right? We don't have 4th, 5th, 6th. It takes a couple generations for a dialect to crystallize. And since the language is being lost, no hay tiempo. para que se cristalice una norma nueva. La verdad. Oh my God, are we going to end on that sad note? Can somebody ask me a more positive question to end? Yes. How long did it take? Oh, mija. Forever and a day. The thing is, I'm not one of those researchers who I admire so much, they have a research question, a research paradigm, they go and they collect their data, and it's like, brrr, bam, and it's there you go. I'm just like, ooh, that looks interesting, and then you start, and then, oh, look, and then there's another rabbit hole, and oh, look at that, and then before you know it, it's like, what have I done? I think I started collecting interviews in 2006 or 7, and like I said, I started it in English. What happened was I was working with Lourdes Torres. We're trying to gather this chispa corpus, right? And we put out the ads. We want Mexicans, we want Puerto Ricans. And this girl shows up to my office, young woman, and she says, yeah, I'm here for the interview. I said, great. So you're Mexican or Puerto Rican? She goes, I'm both. And I go, Puerta, bye. I can't use you. Your Spanish is going to be weird. I need Mexicans and I need Puerto Ricans. And then she leaves and starts going down the hall. And then I'm like, wait, come back. I need to know, and that's when it started to snowball. And I started the interviews in English, and then I realized this is fascinating. Let me interview them in Spanish. So, I'm one of those, just rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole. And then finally I said, if I ever want to make full professor, I've got to stop and publish this book. So I guess the short answer to that is, 2006 to now? How many years? 10 years? That sounds so bad when you say it like that. But I did a lot of other things in between, okay? I did a lot of other things.
This is exactly what true, honest, passionate scholars do. Right? And with that, let's give Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your great questions. Ooh, and I got to talk to this gal before she leaves.